The Bard project all began in 1995 when Ellen and myself set up an event in the Pierce Museum in Rathfarnham, which was an entirely appropriate place to start given its associations with Porrig Pierce, the iconic liberator, freedom fighter, and his visionary school in Rathfarnham. And 35 of us met in Hallamore and basically did what Porrig would have done, which is tell a story. And the one we picked was the wonderful story of Diarmid and Grania and Finn and the Fianna. And I have to say, as we drove away from the Pierce Museum, I just had a feeling that this was worth doing, and just was very pleased. It was just felt a good thing to have done, and I've never changed from that. And why? I think one way of describing it is amidst all the noise in everyday life, which might be likened to the waves at the top of an ocean, noisy. There's another force much deeper, and it's the underlying currents. And I think myth is in many ways a reflection of those deeper cultural forces that shape our lives and our cultures in profound and often hidden and little understood ways. And I think the act of the telling of the stories of a mythic culture is one way to get a handle on those. But I think there's one other reason, which is that in an oral tradition, the only way to pass on wisdom is through non-written means, and the primary one there is stories. So the stories of a culture are collectively sanctioned, they're passed on from generation to generation, and in that regard they have to be regarded as something very special and might be called sacred, albeit that it's not meant in a religious sense, but they're the sacred stories in that they're collectively sanctioned by the people. And in relation to the body of Irish myths, they're first of all extraordinary, and we're very lucky to have such a record for a variety of reasons, not least that the monks took the trouble to write them down pretty faithfully. Obviously they did some reframing of them, but we're very lucky to have this vast and extensive body of work. It's one of the few records of a culture's oral tradition that we have in the Western world. And in the Irish case, it takes you back to Celtic Christian times, to pre-Christian times, and even to pre-Celtic times. And I think that is just very interesting and exciting, because it takes you to the world of the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess, which Danu, which we might assume is a reflection of a matriarchal culture, perhaps, because there's a very feminine feel to that period, and particularly in a story like the Sessa extraordinary journey with her 3 arcs and 50 women and 3 men, and the first person to arrive in Ireland represents an extraordinary start in the mythic history of Ireland. But myself, why am I interested? Well, or what's my mythic voice? Well, I'm particularly interested in myth as a form of persuasion, because in universities we're largely taught another form of persuasion, which is that people are influenced through argument and through stringing facts together, and let's call that blue rhetoric. Myth works in another way. It taps into our emotions and our spirit and our soul, and it is what we might call red rhetoric. So it's the appropriate application of red rhetoric in the law, working with barristers at the moment, and in politics and in organization, whether it's corporate or not-for-profit. And I think the point about this red rhetoric, myth-based persuasion is it can be used for good or bad, and it has been. And I think just understanding how it works and who's using it is an extremely important task, particularly in modernity. And some of the videos that we put together about the American political system at the moment might give some insight as to what's going on from a very different mythic perspective. So it's the Myth of Trump series. So that's my mythic voice.